or take over COVID.
Go ahead.
You already know.
Just AECC.
Just let everybody know, we are on the meeting now. We're not recording yet, but
Okay.
mics are picking.
Gosh, I hate to interrupt your fun.
Thank you.
Oh, you start the recording again? Yes. We are recording now.
Good morning, everyone. Calling to order a meeting of the Funding and Achievement Subcommittee. And back. Glad to have you all this morning. Glad to have people online. Let's start, please, Guthrie, if we're ready with we have a fairly straightforward agenda today. We're going to hear about the very important work of the Community College Funding Formula Group and the progress they have made and set out or hear their timeline for making a presentation to us. But we should be able to get through our business easily and by our deadline. So I'm glad to have you here and glad to be doing this work. So Guthrie, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Chair Rowe,
Here.
Terry Cross.
Here.
Greg Hammond,
Here.
Emily Simnett.
Here.
Richard Devlin,
Here.
Vanessa Becker, Arnell Fajardo, Rukaya Adams.
Okay, and let us know if others join in the meeting, please.
Of course.
Let's see. I think the first agenda item, of course, is the review of the minutes from our last meeting, which was actually in August.
And I believe that those were not actually prepared in time.
Okay, I was going to ask you about those, if we had those. Okay, so we don't have to take that action. So we'll jump right in to public comment. Anyone signed up for public comment?
In addition to anybody who may have signed up on the sheet, we can ask if there's anybody on the line, we can get a chance to.
There's no one in person who signed up.
Okay, anyone on screen wanted to be signed up for public comment? We'll of course also have time for comment or questions as we go through the community college proposal. Okay, we are steaming ahead, folks. Jim Pinkert, please lead us through the review of the work of the funding formula.
Absolutely. Good morning.
Good morning.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, Jim Pinkert, for the record, Co-Secretary of Finance and Capital. Real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm excited. I hope you are too. This is work that's been ongoing for a while, the Community College Support Fund review, formula review process. We haven't brought it to your attention or spoken to you about it for 6 or 7 months. It's been, I think, since February. And so we thought today would be a great time to kind of bring it right around back to your attention, explain where we're at in the process, and then invite 4 different guests to provide perspective and context. And I just want to speak for a couple minutes more before I yield to them for their perspective. So the process itself, a 2-phased approach. The first phase concluded in August, and that focused on the development of the 23-25 ARB and corresponding policy option packages, providing the opportunity for foundational conversations regarding student success, CTE, and other topics. The second phase, which we just started, and I think is going to be a little bit more intense, designed to last through January. This is where we're going to consider the mechanics of the existing funding formula. We're going to get into the weeds of the funding formula itself. We've hired an external facilitator, HCM strategists. We've had them present in the past, and so you may still be familiar with some of their work. But they're going to facilitate and assist with the meetings, provide technical support as well. But we're hoping that the work group, the 25-member strong work group, will provide a consensus-based set of recommendations for the formula for changes they think are appropriate. They're going to make those recommendations to us as HECC staff, And then we're scheduled to bring those to you for your consideration in the during the February 2023 meeting. So February 2023 is going to be a big meeting. I do want to stop and briefly say that will essentially be the start of the conversation around the recommendations themselves. If those recommendations are something you want to support, that will then lead into essentially another phase where we then talk about implementing those recommendations. If substantial dollars are moving around because of those recommendations, as HECC staff, we'll likely want to talk to you about a phased implementation process that could last 2, 3, 4 years, depending upon the magnitude of the movement of funding, because stability in funding is important. But the idea is that the phased transition would likely start with the next fiscal year 2024, which is the very beginning of biennium 23-25. So two-phased approach. The appendix gives you much more information about the work group charge, purpose, guiding principles, areas of consideration, membership, and then what I hope is a very useful process timeline that lays it out for you. I'll pause there, but I do want to yield to our 4 guests. We're going to start with President Tim Cook on behalf of the Oregon President's Council. Who's going to talk about general principles of the review process. Alicia Moore, Dr. Moore, who I want to apologize to publicly because we misspelled her last name on the agenda. Completely my fault. I am still learning. But she is the Vice President for Student Affairs at Central Oregon Community College. And then we have the Executive Director, Matt Visick from the Oregon Trio Association, and then Sheldon Flume, who's the Vice President for Finance at Linden. 4 guests, most of whom serve on the work group itself, who we're going to walk through their perspective. So I'll pause there.
Oh, no, please.
I was gonna wait and let you know when it's my turn. Let me know when it's my turn.
Okay, we'll do, Tim.
Okay.
Jim, would you just explain a little bit when you say the mechanics part of it will be in January? What all is included in that and how different is that from the substance of the recommendations?
They're essentially linked. I think when I speak of the mechanics of the formula, I'm really talking about how the mathematics works, how the different components, I'm hoping that we'll have, for example, an equity component and an enrollment component. Maybe there will be an outcomes, but how all those components actually calculate the distribution of funding per institution is vitally important and something that the business officers right now are focusing their attention on. Because we want to tie that back to the principles. So the policy choices that are made, do we, incentivize transfer credits, for example? Do we focus the majority of the funding on enrollment? Those are policy choices that then get enacted through the mechanics of the formula. So they're really tied together. And at some point, we have to deal with both. Ideally, we'd have an idealized set of policy choices first, then we would discuss the mechanics of the formula and how the formula actually works. But that process can kind of be circular and reiterative because sometimes, as we found like for the university formula review process 2 years ago, we made some policy choices, if you recall, that then kind of moved money around between undergraduate and graduate. And that was an unintended consequence that we flagged before the end of the process. We had to go then back to the mechanics and adjust the mechanics based on the different policy choice. So there's they work in
really the
tandem.
formula, the math. Okay,
That's right.
thank you. Any other questions before we move to our speakers, our presenters?
I ask a clarifying
Yes,
question?
please.
Just because I'm coming into this new. So the policies that you'll be working on the mechanics of have been decided and set, or you have a list of goals or ideals that you're hoping to reach with this next phase?
So the short answer to that question is no. We did, as noted in the appendix, on page 2, offer the work group a set number of areas to consider. So we've kind of provided them with direction in the form of questions. So for example, the first is, what are successful and equitable outcomes for community college students? That's a very deliberate and somewhat leading question, but the idea is to suggest that within the formula, a formula that in its current incarnation has been really the same for the past decade, and with a new set of statewide higher education goals that have been adopted in the time since, does the current formula align with our state goals and support our state goals? And so that's kind of the big picture question, because we want them and think they should be aligned, right? Our funding formula should align to our state's goals. But the question then is, how do we do that? And more specifically, how do we then further kind of supplement the policy, right? So our state's higher education goals are kind of outcomes driven. For the 2-year sector, we know that successful student outcomes are not solely predicated on credential completion. So therefore, the conversation has to broaden to, but what do we mean when we say student success in the 2-year sector? And then if we answer that question, then can we construct a formula around that concept? So it's big picture work. And the formula right now is used to distribute just around 700 million in funding. So high stakes, of course, whenever we talk funding for the institutions. And we have a 25-member work group currently engaged, and it's going to be a year-long process to get through that.
If I may, yeah, I think it's such a good question, and it does bring, I think it usefully brings this subcommittee back to sort of where we were a year ago in launching this process, when at the time, I think there was considerable discussion and even interest in providing the work group with more in the way of specific direction. But ultimately, we concluded, both staff and the subcommittee ultimately, that it would be more productive and I suppose invitational and respectful to set up a set of questions for the work group that guides them without being directed, right? So that the subcommittee of the HECC opted not to say that we expect a proposal for a formula that necessarily incorporates student outcomes in how it distributes dollars, or necessarily incorporates student weights in how it distributes dollars, or necessarily incorporates the fact that some programs are more costly than others in how it distributes dollars. It did, though, put those types of questions and others on the table for the work group members to consider, and really invites them to discuss and engage those issues and come back through staff with a proposal.
Yes, Mr. Hill.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions. In membership of the work group, the 2 HECC members, those are key HECC staff that are serving on the work group. Is that correct?
Jim, do you want to
Jim, who is?
speak to that?
Yes. Yeah, so on the HECC staff is really Donna and me. And we're not voting members. We're there for technical support, to provide guidance. The membership of the work group itself is free to make whatever recommendations they choose, and but we're there to support them in their decision-making process.
A follow-up to that then, and then a second question. Work group like this, given the membership, is it anticipated that it will operate to the degree possible by consensus? Or are we going to have very divided votes on the work group?
That remains to be seen, and Ben and I are both smiling because that's been a conversation point from the very beginning of the process. We certainly hope that come January, the work group develops consensus around a set of recommendations. We will, as HECC staff, consider any minority perspective, any minority reporting. That's why we're involved throughout the process, so that we can properly ensure that the context around each recommendation is recorded and communicated. But my hope certainly is that we develop a substantial amount of consensus around the recommendations that come out of the work.
The second question, we're planning, aren't we, to, given how this will overlap the legislative session, to consult with key stakeholders, both on the policy side and the budget side, legislature?
Yeah, I can speak to that. It's a very good question, and part of the reason for setting up this timeline where the commission would hear and even take initial action on a set of recommendations for formula change in February is in order to allow us to communicate that with and be in communication with legislators early in the legislative session. It could help to inform, and we hope help to support the commission's budget request for the Community College Support Fund. And so that sort of legislative dialogue early and during the legislative session is important. Something we'll be.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm sorry, because these process points are worth, I think, some of them reinforcing both for especially for the commission, but also for our audience. This is familiar to some commissioners as a model for commission decision-making that we frequently employ the use of a work group. As a formal matter, the work group, and Jim mentioned this, but I want to emphasize that the work group's action is advisory to HECC staff. So HECC staff sits at that table and will be taking account of the work group's perspective before delivering a recommendation to the commission about potential rule changes. That, as a process matter, that's important because it helps produce, it makes it possible for the work group to meet without triggering public meeting law. It's not a subcommittee of this commission directly. We, however, have committed to work group members individually, and I think the work group collectively, that we're going to do our very best. The staff is going to do its very best to make sure that the sort of discussion and context and opinions of the work group are, that the staff it reflects that and shares that with the commission. We've also committed that individual members of the work group will have the opportunity to come and address the commission if they feel like the staff recommendation doesn't reflect or is at odds with what they would like to see the commission do relative to the formula, whether they as an individual or a minority of the work group or the majority of the work group says, whoa, you're getting a report from your staff that we don't agree with, right? I think it's, we've committed to making sure that they have the opportunity to come and share with this subcommittee in particular their perspective on what occurred. And, obviously meetings like today's are opportunities for work group members and others to come and say how they think it's going directly with the commission.
Thank you. That's an important point to emphasize. Also, before we switch, I'd just like to say, in reviewing the guiding principles paired with the areas of consideration, the questions that you posed, at least as chair, I will say I read that as very strong and clear and a very good guide for the work group. So if any work group members who are addressing us today disagree with that, I would want to hear that registered now, because it seems to me that it gives you some very good guideposts as you do this important work. Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we'll, without further ado, then turn to our four invited guests. So I think President Cook is going to lead us off. I think we've given them, or at least expressed the intent that they have about 10 minutes each, but that can go longer depending upon the questions you have. And we have two online, or three, I think, online, and then Sheldon Flume is here in person for us. And so, of course, I'll be here in the room if there are any questions for me at any time. So I think with that, President Cook, if you're ready.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners, for the opportunity to talk this morning. I'm sorry I'm not joining you in person. I'm unfortunately recovering from COVID, and I thought it best to be online and not in person today. So I'm sure you understand the choice there. My name is Tim Cook. I'm the president of Clackamas Community College, and I'm this year's chair of the Oregon President's Council. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk. And before I get into my prepared remarks, I did want to make a comment regarding the consensus and the work that I think is happening with the work group and with the HECC. It has been very collaborative, and I think the intent of all of us in this work group is to really come up with a solution that meets the needs of our students and the colleges and everybody in Oregon. So I was hearing the concern and just the part that goes there. I know we still have a lot of detail work to do as we go and get into some of the mechanics around it, but the process itself has been a really collaborative process. And so as we look at consensus and the rest, I would hope that we would find a way to get to that. So I'll back up and give a little history about how we've gotten involved and what the work we've done to date, and then talk a little bit about principles. And I think Alicia and Sheldon and others will be talking then about some more of the detail around the work to date. So we did start back in April when the CCSF work group started with the subcommittee of presidents and to discuss how to support this process and help ensure that recommendations from the work group would work for the 17 community colleges in Oregon. And our first order of business for the president was to discuss principles that could be used in the implementation of a new formula to ensure that any changes will support our existing infrastructure. This last September, we invited community college business officers at one of our President's Council meetings to talk about next steps. And due to the timeline and need to start looking at the impact of the formula changes, a smaller work group of business officers and presidents has been meeting weekly since then. And I believe Sheldon is going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of that work. I want to share the work and commitment to the process has been happening these past 6 months. And I'm going to share the principles that presidents are hoping that the HECC will consider as part of this work group process. So the principles, part of the discussion the small group presidents has had, they started looking at other principles that have guided other states' implementation of new funding formulas. And we looked primarily at California and Washington. We also looked somewhat at Wyoming. But the primary places we looked at were California and Washington. There were 4 principles that we discussed adapting from these other efforts. And as discussed during the work group, there are many elements of the current formula that are very helpful for community colleges and provide stability and predictability each year. And so our first principle, we're hoping will maintain some of the stability and predictability while still moving into targeted funding. And so number 1, the first principle is that any targeted funding we're recommending should be no more than 10% of the total funding to community colleges. Washington State actually has a model that identified 5% as the sweet spot in this targeted funding. This current formula, predictability and stability, is very helpful for budgeting year to year, and particularly working with our labor partners and making sure that we can maintain appropriate support and programs. Starting with no more than 10% will support the stability and change. Our second principle was that we provide 2 years, a minimum of 2 years of program transition funding at a new sufficient base level while the formula metrics are analyzed and refined to ensure their efficacy in advancing student access, equity, and success. This is adapted from some work that California did in their funding formula. This 2 years of transition funding allows for a phase into the new model, and the timeline as it currently stands would be implementing a new funding model in a new biennium with potential unintended consequences or unknowns, which might be a risk for some of our community colleges. And so we're hoping that as we ease into this work, and I believe I heard Jim talk about that as well, that this could take 2 to 3 years to really make sure that we don't have unintended consequences that would impact any of our institutions. Our third principle is that we recognize the necessity of building institutional capacity to improve student outcomes by increasing the community college base funding appreciably prior to implementation of any new funding formula. This is also from California's work around their formula changes. These changes are coming while many of us are still experiencing reduced budgets due to lower enrollments, and another reduction at this time would be very painful or potentially catastrophic for some of our institutions as we go along. So I believe the HECC in your agency request budget has really recognized this as we work toward this funding base before we make any of these shifts, particularly that $50 million that you've proposed in one-time funding as we ease out of the pandemic. And our fourth principle is that we believe that any changes to the Community College Support Fund should be reviewed at a minimum of every 3 years to ensure changes are not widening equity gaps. And this is something that both the Washington and the California models have built in there, is that at least a 3-year review where they're looking and reviewing and making sure that the model is doing what it intended to do and in making any changes or any assessments on that. So those are my prepared remarks. I do again want to, if we have time at the end, there's some questions that we're still considering or thinking about, maybe we can pose, but I want to make sure that my colleagues have an opportunity to talk as well. And I just again want to reiterate that the presidents and everybody in this work group is really committed to this process, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. And I believe I can hand it over to Alicia Moore, who's going to speak next.
All right, thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for having us here today. To echo what Tim, Jim, and others have said, it really is a collaborative group. And to me, the membership reflects that, right? We've got Tim and others from a presidential and a leadership standpoint. You've got myself and others representing the student and the student affairs framework. We have Sheldon and some of his colleagues from a chief financial officer standpoint. So having people think about it from all those multiple angles, I think will make for a really rich discussion, one that can benefit all of Oregon. As Jim mentioned, my name is Alicia Moore, and I'm Vice President of Student Affairs and Strategic Planning for Central Oregon Community College. And I'm grateful to be here with you today. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It was a topic of my dissertation, and the good Greg Heyman was part of my dissertation review committee. So thank you, Greg, for launching me this direction. I think that's a thank you anyway. As others have mentioned, we spent the last several months on just getting everybody up to speed on things like what are the national funding models that exist out there, Washington and California of particular focus. How do we understand the diversity of Oregon's community colleges? And I'll come back to that in a moment. Understanding HECC's equity framework and the resources that are there for institutions, and really diving deep into some best practices that we know that support or credit students, such as placement redesign, developmental education redesign, advising, and others. We also spent quite a bit of time understanding our current funding formula. And while it's new to some on the work group, it really did reinforce that our current formula is not grounded in student success or has students at the center. Instead, it rewards institutions for enrollment growth only. And in higher ed speak, I hope I can say this here, we often refer that to as butts and seats, right? How many bodies come through our door? It doesn't really focus on student success, whether that's measured by progression, retention, or other traditional metrics. Instead, it only is counting heads. And so the other piece of the current funding formula is this approach is not motivating for institutions or its faculty and staff to really think about change in practices or intentionally make that connection between the funding formula and how we conduct our everyday work and support our students. So now we're, the work group now is kind of shifting to what I call the so what factor. So what? We have all this information. What do we do with it? And how do we develop a formula that recognizes the diversity of our students and our communities and our institutions? How does that influence our recommendations and our growing understanding about how our communities are looking for something different? And that's different from each community college. And to this end, I want to briefly highlight the breadth of programs that Oregon's community colleges offered, because we often forget those, right? It's a growing mission. It's a comprehensive community college mission, which is different than many states. So with that, we have our programs from community education that focus on things like health, wellness, art, music. Just sat in on one about the U.S. Constitution, right? They're short-term, intensive, interactive pieces that support our community. We have our small business development centers providing supports to local businesses to succeed and thrive. English language learning classes for those who don't have English as their native language. adult basic education, which is really focused on helping adults who might be at grades level 5, 6, even junior high with their basic skills in writing and math. You add in growing high school programs or dual credit, college now, whatever each institution might call it, which is just an absolutely growing piece of the comprehensive community college mission. And then, of course, we have our career and technical education programs, which are things like paramedic, fire science, aviation, accounting, and so much more. And then, as you all are fully aware, all of our transfer programs, which are designed to help our students transfer to an Oregon college or university, among many others. What's interesting, as of late, conversations amongst the chief academic officers, the chief student affairs officers, is that more and more communities are now starting to demand that their community colleges provide short-term, non-credit professional development in areas such as project management, training people for a contractor's license, training people to be a tax preparer, and a whole slew of other workplace strategies that don't fit that traditional credit-seeking umbrella. And additionally, and Sheldon's going to talk about this in just a moment, more and more communities are looking for those technician-based programs, which are intensive career-focused programs that our students are flocking to, but they often are smaller cohort students because they are very hands-on in nature, or they have clinical and local internship placements that limit how much we can do with those programs. But those are also high-cost programs. So when you look at that diversity of programs that Oregon's Community College offers, it really does paint a complicated and complex picture. And too often we tend to defer to traditional metrics like retention or progression or transfer rates. And when our students are actually experiencing a much different pattern of success. So a lot of our efforts now focusing in our last conversation and again at this week's meeting on Friday, will focus on how do we recognize the diversity of our institutional offerings, the communities we serve, and most importantly, the students we also serve. The complicating piece to this, and it's another curveball in these discussions, and Tim had mentioned this briefly, is also regarding the diversity of our students, right? Community colleges serve an incredibly diverse and rich population of students, but often they're underrepresented populations. And that whether that's students of color, low income, first generation, veteran students, students who may not have the family and financial background to really navigate that system. And oftentimes for this population, just like our businesses seeking non-credit training, success looks wildly different than simply completing a degree and transferring. So in the end, Oregon's community colleges are incredibly diverse in the communities we serve, the students we serve, and our work going forward will really focus on how do we meet that demand so our students and the state as an entire community can succeed. It's going to be a rich discussion. It'll be a robust discussion, and I'm thankful for all the good thinking that we have in our group, as I think we'll come forward with a model that will help us be successful with this funding formula, and hopefully set a model for the rest of the U.S. if I really had my wishes. Thanks so much for my time today, and I think I'm going to turn over to Sheldon to talk a little bit about it from the Chief Financial Officer perspective.
I think it's Matt next.
Yes. Matt?
Absolutely. Yes, thank you all for inviting me into this group here today. My name is Matt Bezick with the Oregon Trio Association. Sorry I can't be there today. I'm running a conference. I'm on like day 3 of running a conference in Eugene for some regional trio professionals, which has been perfect to prepare for this meeting because I was brought here to kind of bring that student perspective, that boots on the ground professional perspective of what is working for these students and what are the challenges that these students are facing. And I actually love that Alicia just went first there because a lot of the pieces she just touched on are going to pop up here again. So, and it's a lot of bullet points because I've just been getting a lot of feedback from all the folks who work at the community colleges, as well as high schools throughout the state who are working with high school students looking to enroll in community college. So I can put these together to have some structure and report back to you all, but it's going to be a little all over the place because I've just been collecting them as these past few days have been going forward. If you are unfamiliar with TRIO programs, they are federally funded grants that nonprofits or institutions can apply for that serve low-income and first-generation students. So we are been around for over 50 years in terms of the actual TRIO programs themselves. All the funding comes federally. They renew their grants every 5 years. and they just specialize in serving underrepresented students and have robust data because the Department of Ed requires it to kind of demonstrate our effectiveness. So there is a long history there of showing that we do a really good job at serving these students. And part of the reason for that, kind of the first point I want to make, is it's just smaller caseloads, right? Like one of the challenges when it comes to funding is like it's hard to, at the community college level, to afford to have tons of student support staff so that you can have smaller caseloads in advising. Like our average community college TRIO professional has about a 65-to-1 caseload, which allows them just to spend more time with those students, and underrepresented students tend to require more time, as is, but it's often even misleading because about 80% of your time is spent with 20% of those students. So even the majority of them can manage relatively well. But the challenge I faced before doing this role at the state level and supporting all of our TRIO programs, I did advising at the high school level up in Astoria. So with Clatsop Community College, that's who I was employed by. And we often found one of our biggest challenges, we collect these data over a lot of years on all of our students. Did they graduate high school? Did they enroll in college? Did they complete an associate's? Did they complete a bachelor's? We follow them for 6 years after high school and just track what is or is not effective. And one of the most remarkable things I think about Oregon is in almost all aspects of college, cost is just the biggest deal. Like being able to afford to go to college is usually the greatest barrier, and that maintains to be that when you're pursuing a bachelor's. But in Oregon, that was never an issue for most of the students we worked with that were underrepresented. Between Oregon Promise, between Pell Grants, just the cost of community college courses were always relatively affordable. So what that did is it made it almost essential that all students like very seriously considered enrolling in a community college first, because it's just financially going to set you up to be so much more successful, and you can still get on that pathway to transfer and get a bachelor's degree. Whereas it is incredibly difficult to afford to go to a four-year school. But when we track the data of completion numbers, and obviously there is a bit of a sample size issue there because students who are getting into four-year schools tend to be higher achieving students. But we saw those graduation rates of students who started at a four-year school in the mid 80% in terms of did they actually finish that bachelor's degree. And then when we looked at data of students who started at the community college, the percent that actually finished with the associate's degree was in the teens. So it created this immense challenge of like, realistically, they all should start at a community college because that's what they can afford, but they're not finishing. So it felt disingenuous to send them into those spaces. And I just an observation in our data, but I think that's the work that this group is trying to do, is how do we strengthen these systems and the student support that we offer at the community college level. So I'm kind of just going to go through some bullet points here of things that feedback that I've got from all the professionals around indicating what is working, what some of the challenges are. So one of the main comments I got is the dual credit students tend to do better. So if we can create partnerships between the high schools and the community colleges, those students do better, especially in the CTE focused pathways, because those are folks that just want to do some work. And if they have the capacity to take those courses while in high school and be on their way, it results in much better success. They have much clearer ambitions as they kind of transition into community college. I would say that a lot of the feedback I get is the students we serve in our TRIO programs, the average student is non-traditional. It is not actually your student coming from high school straight into a community college. It is adults coming back in the workforce, and the goal should be to not waste their time. Like they kind of have whole lives already and they're trying to improve their life through education, which is awesome. That's their fundamental right to do that. We need to make sure that we're not wasting their time throughout that process. So sometimes I think we get very focused, and even in our own programs at the TRIO level, we get very focused on, helping transition high school students into community college and then transfer and beyond. But most of our students are just looking to take some classes. So a continued investment in the pathways, right? Having very clear pathways so they don't take a wrong class or they miss enrolling in a class that's only offered once a year. That's been an amazing investment already. So just a continued investment in kind of making very crystal clear pathways so students know they got their one sheeter and there's no confusion about what the process is going to be for them to finish. as well as just having like consistent course classifications, because if you do want to eventually transfer, you want to make sure everything is transferring, right? Again, not wasting their time. We don't want somebody to transfer to a four-year institution and then have to do extra semesters because they, unbeknownst to them, perhaps wasted their time in some courses they were doing at community colleges. I think there also needs to be an understanding that some of the degree attainment numbers are going to be low in community college because not everyone is trying to get a degree, right? Some are just doing some workforce development and they just want to take a few classes. And that's, again, where those pathways were perfect for that, right? They kind of had those certificate levels. And sometimes that's all the students are looking for out of that. So just understanding where those motivations are for our non-traditional students, because ultimately they want flexibility. Like COVID forced all of our community colleges to kind of shift and provide some online flexibility, but that is definitely what they want, and it's challenging to provide student support services to them. So even in our TRIO programs, like that's a massive gap in the kind of students we serve. Students who are just maybe an hour and a half away from campus and taking all their courses online, like those are not students that we're serving. Like they're kind of out of our purview and not within kind of the traditional services that we provide to support students. So I think as we are kind of looking at the funding formula, some of the challenges we face is we often try to create check marks or like certain boxes that every single student has to check. But obviously, like it's more effective to serve with more equity and not necessarily equality. So just kind of understanding that not all students need the same amount of support. So kind of what I talked about earlier is most of the time our staff spend working with students is with a smaller portion of students that are very high needs. The other ones kind of get access to some additional resources through TRIO programs, but ultimately can manage fairly well on their own and don't need as much of that hand.
Matthew? We can't hear you. Oh, you're
I
back.
tapped on the mute button. There we go. All right. So I know I was talking about just kind of understanding not all students need the same amount of support. What I heard from a lot of programs, and this would seem contradictory because the thing TRIO does really well is we just have lots of people, right? We are able to have extra bodies that work in student support services at community colleges that the colleges don't have to pay for, and those students tend to be more successful. So you would assume that investing in more people and more staffing would be the way to get more success, but that is just so immensely costly. And what I heard is that automation, whenever is possible, is just better for an average student. Like you need to create spaces for those who need more help, and that's kind of what we do. But if you can have really great systems and automation to kind of meet the needs of most average students, if they can navigate it themselves, particularly as they're wanting to do more online stuff, and these non-traditional students who have whole lives and families, they're just trying to cram in school and in the spaces in between that, would really make for things to be more effective, especially if you're looking to serve students to scale, right? So it doesn't have to all be in just more staff, more people in those realms, because we all understand that like the instruction is what the bread and butter, that's what people go for, that is what you're ultimately selling is instruction, but we obviously want to support students better. So finding a nice balance between investing in good systems that work, are clear, are understandable for your average student, and then having those support systems around to help people that can't quite navigate that as easily. So the last couple things I wanted to touch on, some folks would love to know if there's been any data or studies done on those Oregon Promise first year success courses and just what the impact was, because that's one of the things that the four-year schools do amazing. They make you live on campus freshman year. They make you take those like classes that seem a little useless your like freshman year that just kind of bring you together and teach you some of these general soft skills, right? The employability skills, some of those sort of things. And that was kind of what those Oregon Promise courses were doing, but each kind of community college had to develop its own thing. And I from what I've heard, it was done at various different scales. Sometimes people even just couldn't enroll all the Oregon Promise students. Like it was a requirement for having received those funds, and they just didn't have the capacity to even support all those students. So I would love to see kind of what the impact was and were those students more successful. I know that there's been starting to have studies done on some of those Oregon Promise things now that we're a couple years out of it. But if we can offer more credits for those kind of courses too, make them meaningful towards, like, again, not wasting people's time. Make sure that the courses they're taking are earning credits that are actually going to help them attain the degrees that they want. And one of the things you touched on, Alicia, and it is costly, but the CTE investments and those internships, like that's just is going to streamline, because nothing is worse than we get students, especially underrepresented students, that overcome so much to even get into college, and then they complete a college degree and then they just don't get jobs in the, you know, the work field that they just got a degree in, because they kind of struggle to transfer into that. So having kind of pipelines and internships to help transition our students into those fields is very worthwhile, and make sure that all this investment that the state has put into educating these people actually results in them getting employment in these fields. So that is kind of stuff that's all over the place, but those are a bunch of the bullet points that I got from feedback from the advisors and directors at our programs throughout the state at community colleges. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Madam Chair, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Sheldon Flum. I'm the Vice President of Finance and Operations at Linden Community College. And I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of the business officers, some of the mechanics that President Cook talked about. That is what we deal with. So I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges and some of the information and direction that we need to actually build a formula. But when I'm talking about the challenges, please don't take that as we can't do it or an excuse. It's what we need to have to do it right. And I will apologize up front with the smoke moving back into the valley. My sinuses are, and allergies are acting up. If I'm a little clogged, that's why, not COVID. But, you know, when we look at the current formula, one thing we need to recognize is that it does work. It does distribute the funds. It's predictable, it's stable, and we understand it. But it is based primarily on FTE. There's a little bit of factor in there for the size of the institution. But, you know, we do understand how it works. And when we're looking at the formula, one of the things the business officer look at is, you know, we do have a stop gain in there. So if some the institutions get more CTE, or excuse me, FTE in a year, they can only gain so much. From a operational standpoint, after this pandemic, we would like to see something like that put in the revised formula, so we have a stop limit on the bottom side. So that, you know, if we do have a huge decrease in FTE or whatever the new formula is, it stops that and gives us a chance then to go back and manage the enrollment or whatever it is to go forward. And it is important to realize that there's a difference between a loss limit and a stop loss. And Jim and I have had conversations on this. So if it's a stop limit, so they put 5%, you know, if it drops down 5%, it stops there, it's for 1 year. Because then that rolling 3-year average will take effect and it goes forward. If you're putting a stop loss, you're saying, okay, everything's going to be held even for, you know, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is. And then at the end of that, then you have to say, okay, is that the baseline going forward? Or how's that going to work? So there's a lot of things that get complicated in that. But what we're trying to accomplish is, you know, everyone has said, is to align the distribution formula with the goals of the state. And while it sounds easy, it really is not. So I'm going to be talking about CTE, because what we have to do is pick something, see if we have the data to support it, see what the data looks like, and how that might move into a formula. So that's That's what we've been doing, and there's been a lot of talk about CTE. But what is CTE? Career and Technical Education. As I looked into this, I did not realize the breadth of the programs that are in CTE in Oregon. We have business, accounting, we have IT, network systems, healthcare, variety of things in there, machining and culinary programs. And some of those programs are very expensive. Now, accounting, business, that's more of your traditional class. But at Linden, if you walk into our building that has our machining program, you can tell right away that's an expensive program. We probably have 8 or 10 CNC machines in there. We have a variety of the older machines. We have all the tools that go with it. It's a very large building and has very small classes in it because they need that one-on-one work. They need access to the machinery. So it drives up the cost of those programs. And one of the things about CTE is when you look at like that machining class, they're not easy. One, you have the cost. And with a lot of the CTE programs, we have trouble finding instructors because they can go out into industry and make a lot more money than we can pay them. The other problem we have is you have to stay current with the technology. It is constantly changing. And if you're going to be training students to go out into the industry to be working, you have to be training them on the latest equipment that's out there. So when we started to look at, incentivizing CTE, the first thing I did was start to look at the data. And so we looked at a 3-year rolling average, and just to remind everybody, that is 30%, 30%, 40%. So this data is 18, 19, 19, 20, and 2021. And so we had an average of just over 20,000 CTE FTE. And when you break that down by the colleges, that's an average of 28%. Clatsop has the highest percentage of CTE FTE. When you look at the total, they're almost 50%. Mount Hood is 40%. Then Tillamook is at 21%, and Portland is at 22%. So you've got this wide grouping of numbers there. But then it gets more complicated. Because when you look at Clatsop, they have that 50%. That's only 3% of that total FTE, the CTE that's generated for the state. Mount Hood is, their 40% is 13%. Tillamook, their 21% is only 0.5%. But Portland, which had 22% of their total FTE is based in CT classes, it's almost 25% of the total credit hours for the state. Now, the reason I bring that up is it complicates how do you set your goals and measure what you're looking for. So if you're going to say we want all colleges to increase their CTE numbers by 5%, well, that's going to be just about impossible for Clatsop because they're already so high. It may be possible for some of the other colleges. If you look at how the percentage is based on total number of CTE in the state, then Portland's always going to come out on top because they have the sheer numbers. The other thing you need to look at is when you look at like Tillamook at their 21%, how do you tell if they're meeting the needs of their community? You have to actually go to that college and say, are you meeting it? If not, why? And if it's because they don't have, the funds to build those programs, if you just base your formula on, okay, the more CTE you have, the more money you get, what you've done is you've incentivized CTE in one area and you're penalizing other colleges. Because if you take away funding from the lower colleges, like Tillamook, how are they ever going to increase their CTE programs because they're expensive and they now don't have the funding because you just reduced it? So these are some of the things that we as business officers look at when we're trying to build a formula, trying to check the scenarios on how is it going to work? What's it going to look like? And the other thing we've talked about is whatever we're incentivizing, can we do that with new funding? Which would be the preferred way to do it, because then you've stabilized the funding that the college is already running on. Looking at new programs, new measures with new funding. What you have to be careful there is if you have new funding that is just straight for startup. So I'm going to give you $100,000, go start up an expensive CTE program. Start it, get staff, get students in it, and then at the end of 4 years, that money goes away, goes into the formula. And what you've done is you've set up an expensive program at a college that no longer has the funding to support it because it's gone back into the big pool and gets redistributed by FTE and whatever the incentives are. So again, you have to be careful how you set that up. But when we're incentivizing CTE, what does that really mean? Does that mean you're going to help the community colleges support these expensive programs so they're less expensive for our students? Or does it mean you're going to incentivize CTE programs to put out more graduates to meet the needs of your community partners so that it drives their business and drives the local economy? Or does it mean that you're going to incentivize it to get underserved students in there so then they get the skills and credentials that they need to go out and good jobs and support their families? I mean, we're talking about CTE, but three very different things. And so what we need as business officers and as colleges is some very clear direction on why we're going to incentivize whatever it is. So then we can build the support programs around it and build the funding formula to support that. The other thing we need to do is if you say, okay, CTE is what we're going to do, you have to look at why some colleges aren't doing it well. What are the obstacles? Because if you incentivize something that can't be fixed or increased, then it doesn't do any good. So again, why is it not working? The other thing we've talked quite a bit about is, do we have the right data? I brought up the data for the CTE, and you can see the complexity there. And one of the other speakers mentioned it about completion. Is degree completion, certificate completion, is that success? Maybe not. We lose, I shouldn't say we lose, we have a lot of our CTE students that are hired before they complete their programs because they're in internships and they can go out in the field and make $40 an hour. So why would you finish that program? So those are the things you have to look at. When we're talking about determining an underserved population, how do we identify them? We've talked about, well, do you look at the financial part of it? Well, the FAFSA is the easiest way to do that, but not all students fill out a FAFSA, especially if they're undocumented. So then how do you bring the numbers in for those groups? And then how do you get that formula to represent what you want to do? And the other thing we've talked about when we're talking about data, is this the right time? So if you go back and look, we have 9 years worth of good data since the Great Recession. That was the last big disruption in community colleges enrollment. No one expected the decline to be as sharp and as long as it has been. Then we have 3 years of pandemic, which the numbers are all messed up. And now we're going to post-pandemic. So is that 9 years before the pandemic? Is that a good judge and guide on where we're going to go next? We don't know. We don't know what the new normal is going to be. And our last point of concern that President Cook mentioned too, is the timeline. If you're asking us to have a fully operational formula by February, we could do it, but it's probably not going to be very good. Because what we do when we set up a formula is you set it up, you get the data, you put it in there, use the numbers from the last 3 or 4 years to see how it comes out, and starts looking for unintended consequences. What's going to happen? How's it going to blow up? And when I was in Wyoming and we put in a new formula, we spent 1.5 years working out the details just to ensure that it worked properly. And then we actually did use it. We did have problems and had to fix it. It's going to happen. But what I can tell you from the business officer's point of view, if you give us the good data, you give us good direction, we can build a formula that's going to work and help support our community colleges and hopefully help reach the educational goals of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions, commissioners, for our panels?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair, for any of the panels. The commission has made its recommendations part of the agency recommended budget for the community college support fund. Part of that recommendation includes a modest amount of transition funding, recognizing the significant decline in enrollment both before the pandemic and since the pandemic. Also recognizing even community college's own projections, if they don't expect the enrollment to be increasing substantially anytime in the near future. How do you see that discussion being embedded into this discussion, or will it be? This discussion over the transition.
President Cook, perhaps? You're on mute.
Thank you. I want to make sure I understand the question. So how will the, if I'm understanding, the $50 million in transitional funds be used or be embedded as part of this conversation? Is that the question?
That's part of the question, but I'm maybe not being as clear as I should be. I mean, I think the commission is saying that not only the commission, but the outside world is going to recognize that there's been a substantial change in the number of students enrolled in community colleges. And what's the future going to be like? How will the funding fit into that? And is there going to be a discussion on this transition as part of this forming discussion?
Yeah, I would, I'll take a stab at that, and then if anyone else has anything to add, please do so. I think we are grateful for that recommendation for that transitional funding as a recognition of this decreased enrollment and this transition out from the pandemic and where we're going. You know, the way I look at this, I mean, the community college world is changing pretty dramatically and pretty quickly in who we serve and how we serve and what we need to do that. So the discussions you heard today around focus on CTE and focus on equity are really critical. I was surprised recently to look at, you know, at Clackamas Community College, the shift in non-credit offerings has increased quite a bit, and it looks like that will continue to do so. And then just the demographic issues around high school students graduating and that, you know, that being flat or a little decline over the next 10 years, knowing that we really need to focus on our adult students and that many of them, I think as Matthew pointed out, don't need a degree. They just need a class or two. So we're, that transition time, that funding to be able to do that as we go into this model, I think from my perspective is an important part of this conversation because it will help us make some of those transitions and shifts into our current spending, but also then do some planning with this funding model about how that will, how that may or may not change then how we're funded moving forward in these different aspects of it. So I may not have answered your question directly, and if any of the panelists want to help out, that would be great, or have anything to add.
Oh, thank
No,
you.
I'm sorry. Did you have something else to add? Go ahead.
Oh, mine will be long, so.
I was just going to add that from a budgetary standpoint, that transition funding is very critical. When you look at your base budget for a institution, roughly about 60% of it, 40 to 60, depending on size of your institution, the cost does not fluctuate with enrollment. It's your overhead and your base. And so that's where that transitional funding is going to help us get set up for whatever's coming going forward. And if we can work that into the formula, that would be awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. More observations or just feed into the conversations, I have to say. I really appreciate Dr. Moore's comments on the limitations of the current model, which I think is an important perception. I think starting from the perception that the current model is fine, why are we trying to change it, really biases the conversations in ways that I don't think give us the perspective that we need going forward. The current model is very much based on a traditional student pursuing a traditional pathway. And I think you were eloquent in describing that goals that students have are much more diverse than that model would represent. And the kinds of students we serve are much more diverse than that model would represent. And so it would seem to me that we together should be motivated to figure out how we can devise a model that better reflects that diversity of goal and diversity of the students that we serve. Our model is almost exclusively based on seat time, not even credits, seat time, which really reflects the traditional goal of the community college, which was pretty exclusively access. And been a good amount of research that would indicate that access alone actually exacerbates inequity, doesn't help resolve it. And so it seemed to me that we would all be motivated for something that is less based on that one variable. I worked in a number of states. Sheldon and I both worked in Wyoming, not at the same time, but we did. And I found that we have so often amongst community colleges argued that our model is really complicated, but it isn't. I think the simplest one I've ever had to work with is it only has one variable. It has multipliers, but it only has one variable. Wyoming, you have an operational base that isn't contingent on FTE, so you don't suffer from the kinds of anxiety that we do when we start talking about throwing out the model and going to something different. And so I think there are a lot of things that we can be doing, and I really want you to encourage. I don't know how much of a scope we want to have in terms of our goals of moving forward. Maybe we do one step here, and off into the future there are additional steps. But I think I love the suggestion that we review this every 3 years. I think we should have been doing that for the last few decades. I think that but I think every funding model balances two issues, and I think that were represented well. One is stability, security, and the other is opportunity. And they do compete with each other in a funding model, and I think we need to find the appropriate balance. If all we focus on is stability and security, we limit our opportunity to achieve the goals that we talk about and are challenged to actually accomplish. If we only focus on opportunity, we put the structure of our effort at risk. And so, it's not one or the other. So I just want to encourage you. I think you're talking about a lot of the right things, and I'm excited. I want to make sure. I think if we start from the premise that the basic current model works okay, I think that's the wrong premise. I don't think it does. I think it works to produce the outcomes that we're currently achieving, and we want something different. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Yes.
I want to commend our panel. I think the purpose of our invitation was to make sure that our committee is well educated about the issues and I am swimming in the data, as they say right at the moment. And the thing that I appreciate most about our conversation this morning is the complexity of the task that you have in front of you. And the importance of balancing all of those things. I appreciate that you're having the conversation in the way that you are in the work group. One of the things I think I know about dealing with complexity is the importance of staying based in principles. So I appreciate you having come to some understanding and agreement about what those principles are going to be. They sound like they're on target to me. We can have some more dialogue about that this morning. The thing that strikes me the most about all of your presentations is that each institution, while there's lots of diversity in size and programming, they're all striving to meet the needs of their communities, and they all do that in different kinds of ways. Greg just talked about the balance between the stability and the opportunity. My sense is that we do have, this is a moment of opportunity, and we would be ill-advised to miss it. And it is also a time of high risk, and we would be remiss if we didn't stabilize things for the community colleges. So I don't know how you're going to get there, but I appreciate that you are having this dialogue to get there. I think our job is to stay informed and to be educated about what to do with your recommendations when you come forward. So that was just a long-winded way of saying thank you.
Very articulate way of saying thank you. Are there any questions? If not, I'd like to add my thanks and appreciation, and Chair Cross and Commissioner Hayman really hit on most of the points I was going to hit on. But the fact that you have done an honest assessment of the current model within the context of our conditions and as you say, the huge change that is upon us and is going to continue, and how quickly and dramatically the community college world is changing, and our absolute mandate to respond to students and citizens who will be students and non-citizens and their needs. I also wanted to commend you, in addition to the things they cited, wanted to commend you for looking outside of Oregon and seeing what information and experience and lessons you can gain, especially from our neighbors in California and Washington. So thank you for all of it, for considering the diversity of students, especially for looking at, hey, gosh, we've considered that success is measured primarily one way, and all evidence is telling us that it is not. We recognize the difficulty of the task. We recognize the shortness of the timeline, and also recognize the difficulty in coming together and the fact that you are committed to consensus. I think it is still very important that we hold to the February date that we can for your recommendations, just because of the dramatically changing situation that you all face and that community colleges do, and the scope of the challenges. So we will stay in close touch with you. I am extremely encouraged with the progress you've made and with your deep commitment. So this has been very enlightening for us, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you also. Okay. Mr. Pinkert, I think you were up again, and we will move to capital improvement and renewal funding. This also is an update of action item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, it is. It's not, not a topic that we normally discuss with much frequency outside of the ARB process. But because this cycle, such a large pot of dollars is involved, I thought it might be a good idea just to make sure you're aware of what shenanigans we're up to use a phrase. But so the CIR is a program over the years that revolves around the improvement and renewal of existing space. This is only for the public universities. You may recall 3 years ago when we completed the strategic capital development plan for the universities, the number one takeaway recommendation from that report was you've got plenty of space based on projected enrollments. But number two, a lot of that space is desperately in need of renewal, improvement, making it better space for the planned use going forward. A lot of it's old space. And so we work, the state, the state legislature, we at the HECC have worked to kind of create this capital improvement renewal funding, really to focus on code compliance, safety issues, accessibility issues. A lot of the older buildings were built well before the American with Disabilities Act was ever envisioned. They're not accessible. Some of them have severe code compliance issues. You know, when you're doing a major renovation, at some point you cross the threshold where you got to upgrade the facility in terms of its safety, fire response. You have to put in sprinkler systems, wider hallways and stairways and stuff like that. So we want to afford the universities the opportunity to address some of those safety issues, those code compliance issues first. And then second, this funding is also really used to help them address deferred maintenance, especially critical deferred maintenance issues. So that's kind of what this is for. It is distributed via a two-component framework within Google. First, based on space. How much space do you have? And so we measure that by education in general, or what we call E&G gross square feet. And the second metric is a density factor, a weighted density factor. So essentially, we distribute this funding based on the size of your campus infrastructure and how dense it is. How many faculty, staff, students do you have using that space? More dense space wears out quicker and is typically in need of more frequent maintenance. So of the total funding available, 85% is distributed based on gross square foot. The 15% remainder is distributed based on that weighted density factor. So for this cycle, next spring, we're going to have $110 million available for this purpose, which is substantially more than we've had in the past. In the current session, I believe we have $65 million. So that $110 million or $45 million increase is a full 50% increase for the institutions. These are state bonds that get sold. These are Article 11 Q bonds, Article 11 in the state constitution Q bonds, which means the state of Oregon pays all of the debt service, both principal and interest, on behalf of the universities. And so this $110 million tranche or slice of funding for this cycle includes $80 million that was appropriated in the regular session, what we asked for in our agency ARB, and then the legislature, to their great credit, added 30 million additional dollars to address extraordinary inflation in both construction, labor, and materials costs. Inflation is really killing us in the commercial market. So you can see in tables 1 and 2 and 3, these are the preliminary allocations by institution. Specifically in table 3, you'll see the current allocation of 65 million in the current biennium and the preliminary allocation in 21-23. I keep saying preliminary because these calculations between now and November could change slightly if we get, and when we expect to get updated FTE numbers in November, that could change this distribution slightly. And so I just want to be cognizant of that. And so you'll see again, total increase is 55%. Because the three bigs, OSU, PSU, and University of Oregon have about 80% of all the gross square feet. The 4 remaining trusts have about 20%. Any increase, predominantly, the majority of that money will go to the 3 bigs just because of their size. And they also tend to be more dense as well. They use their space with more density. As you could probably see in table 2, with the density ratio being higher for them than the trusts. And so in the appendix is just kind of a short history. I'm going back to the 2015-17 session, but I'll simply point you to the 110 million appropriated for the current session leads to a total of $415 million that has been appropriated for this purpose over the last, well, since since 2007 and 9. So I'll stop there for any questions, comments, issues, but I did just not asking you to vote or take any action, but I did want to bring this back to your attention because it's 110 million, a 50% increase. In our ARB, we did ask for yet again another increase, not being shy from asking for the funding we think the institutions need for deferred maintenance. And so for 23-25, we did ask for, I think it was 90 million for a little bit.
Mr. Devlin? Thank you, Madam Chair. These numbers are not really as specific as they sometimes are identified. Do we know what we need on a biennial basis for the amount of deferred maintenance not to increase? And what is the overall number that the university is giving us for amount of deferred maintenance?
We do. So I'm gonna, I apologize. I'm gonna reverse my answers to your question. The second question you asked, in terms of the total amount of deferred maintenance, that is a difficult answer because we rely on each university individually to determine that number for themselves. So unlike for all state agencies where the Department of Administrative Services, through the state architect, they hire a consultant, an outside party to do an analysis of all state facilities, which leads to a very consistent measurement across each facility all around the state. The universities use slightly different approaches at each institution. Not good, not bad, just a slightly different approach. Some of them focus more on condition analysis. Some of them don't, depending upon their ability to conduct that work. Their total deferred maintenance, as I understand it, is about $1 billion to $1.1 to $1.2 billion. And the current replacement value of, and I only focus on E&G facilities when I answer this question. They have about 16 to 17 million square feet of E&G space. That does not include all of their athletic facilities, their dorms, their other auxiliary spaces, which by themselves would probably add another 4 to 5 million square feet of space. But that 16 million square feet in space in E&G has a current replacement value in the neighborhood of about 10 to $10.5 billion. So the 1 billion divided by 10, it's about 10%, as in terms of a CRV, a deferred maintenance ratio. I often think of it in a ratio, so it's about 10%. Most experts, when you ask them, in answer to your first question, how much funding is needed, every year, typically they'll say about 2%. You need to invest about 2% of the current replacement value to forestall, any deferred maintenance or to keep your deferred maintenance manageable. A ratio of 10% or less is ideal, and we're about 9-10%. At last calculation, I think we were at 9.5. It's because you're never going to get to zero. You're always going to have some deferred maintenance, and that's where we get into a differentiation between critical deferred versus routine deferred, which sounds a little odd and counterintuitive, but if I have a roof, for example, roofs last typically 20 years. In the Pacific Northwest, they last longer. So its lifespan, projected lifespan is 20 years, but I may wait to year 25 before I replace it. Technically, for 5 years, it's deferred maintenance, but I deferred that on purpose. So not all deferred maintenance is bad necessarily. It's bad when it becomes a life safety issue or something like that.
Ratio number has come down. Both probably because of investment in new facilities and restoration facilities. Also because of the underlying growth cost of replacement. It's not entirely just the deferred maintenance being addressed, is if buildings are valued at higher value, then your percentage comes down. So you still may have just as much deferred maintenance, it's just represents a small portion of the overall picture.
That's exactly right, and I'm glad you made that point, because the $10 billion for current replacement value has grown from, I think, 10 years ago, it was 5 or 6 billion. Right, so in the past decade alone, it's substantially increased. Now, some voices have argued it's that number is almost irrelevant because we wouldn't seek to go out and replace the University of Oregon campus all at the same time. Right now, other voices will say, but wait a minute, if you had a Cascadia event, you might. But so I think that current replacement value number is very hard to nail down. We try to assess it with the engineers, the structural engineers, and the architects to say, if I had a similar building, 200,000 square feet, I had to build it brand new, what would that cost, right? So they do their best, but your point is well taken. Inflation grows that number, so that ratio grows all on its own for no other reason than the current replacement value grows. But that's also why, again, 2%, $10 billion, that'd be $200 million or $400 million every biennium. And we've stopped short, of course, well short of asking for that level of funding, simply because that's a big number. And because that CRV number is somewhat subjective, the deferred maintenance number, I'll also point out, is somewhat subjective. And this 415 million just for CIR funding does not include the about $2.2 billion that has also been provided by the state legislature over the last 15 years for other related capital projects. And so it is our expectation, and we've been very clear about this with the universities, if you undertake a major renovation of a building, you address all the deferred maintenance in that building. When you're done with that major renovation, you should have no deferred maintenance for that building. And they are doing a good job of catching their catch can as they renovate some of their buildings.
Commissioner Hayman.
Thank you, Chair. May have just answered the question. I guess I'm a little definitionally confused here. Is this, I guess I had understood this money not to be technically deferred maintenance, but sort of renovation or repurposing of space, which I thought that'd be different. So is this a subcomponent of that, or are you really chiseling away at deferred maintenance?
It's the stated goal of this is to really prioritize health, safety issues, code compliance, and accessibility.
Okay.
But I will say though that to their great credit, many of the universities have caught up and addressed a lot of those issues. And so then the priority after is to tackle what deferred maintenance you can. So, and that looks different at the different campuses, especially for U of O, OSU with much older buildings. And so you can put, an accessibility ramp on the outside of the building going into it. But also they'll use the money for, repairing roofs, because the roof might be 30 years past its lifespan. So then it becomes a critical deferred maintenance. So they'll walk through a priority process. Do I have a code compliance issue? I'm going to fix that first. If I don't, well, what's my critical deferred maintenance? And can I fit that within this funding? Or is it a separate project all its own? I think it's important to note that with this funding, we essentially work with DAS and the state treasury to sell the bonds. So if we're going to sell $110 million worth of bonds in the spring, we earmark the money for each institution. And the institution itself gets to choose how they prioritize the use of that funding. Versus another project is in our ARB where the state legislature decides whether that project in its entirety gets funded. So the institutions themselves can reprioritize based on their need at the time they're making that decision. So.
I guess, if I can follow a question, I
Please
apologize.
do.
I guess in your introduction, I guess I'd understood this as sort of an alternative to building new square footage. So I guess in my head, I understood that differently. That's usually referred to as repurposing of something instead of building something new.
No, I think that's
I
right.
want to know if
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, and we were, and I'll further double down on that point simply because in the strategic capital development plan, and it was very clear that there are space deficiencies at PSU's campus and at OSU Cascades because it's a new campus, but across all 7 universities, there's a huge surplus of space. And so we've been very clear with the campuses, if you submit, a project for new construction, it likely won't fare well under our rubric, and it likely won't be a very high priority. It just
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of Cascades, of course, because it's a brand new.
Mr. Simon?
Yes, I just, just had a comment, and I wanted to thank you for this detailed information, and this is really a great primer for me being new to this process and understanding that the capital, how the capital improvement needs are met. And I want to say that it is very heartening to see that there is a focus on doing some of the work, particularly in increasing accessibility. As somebody who works at U of O and is in some of those classrooms that are not very accessible, it is a huge need on campus. We'll be returning to one of those classrooms when I go back to the campus this week. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for and to reiterate the importance of doing that kind of work, supporting the students in the space.
Yes, thank you. We were just this past summer on campus at all 7 of the universities, including Cascades, and later at the end of this month, we're going to go back to the 3 main, U of O, OSU, PSU, just because we have questions, we're curious, and we want to better understand all of their facilities, all their priorities, how they create their campus master plans, and how state funding plays a role in that. So we keep as in touch with them as best we can. We were also at 7 or 8 of the different community college campuses this summer as well. And their needs are very, very similar, although more acute in that many of them, 10 of our 17 community colleges were all founded in the 60s and early 70s. And because of that, it's surprising when you go to their campuses, they were all built in, the kind of a similar fashion, the precast concrete.
That's a nice name.
Yeah, it looks Eastern European. I mean, it's just, anyway, it's very harsh. And the college campuses do a great job of softening the edges with color, with plantings, with green spaces. But that means then many of those buildings, all at the same time, right, are at that 50, 60, 70-year mark. And that's important because after year 50, these buildings are typically built for a 50-year lifespan, after which they need a major renovation. So it's not like it's convenient where you have every 3 or 4 years, another building. It's not equally spaced. We've got, I don't know, a few million square feet of space on our college community campuses that are all right now in need of major gut renovations. And so it's a particular challenge, and capital, we often think in terms of buildings, but IT capital infrastructure and utility-based capital infrastructure is just as in need, just as demanding, and we don't have necessarily rubrics to address those either.
Madam Chair, just an aside, and I want to put something else on the table too. The aside is that you don't normally run into historical advocates in trying to replace 1950s and 1960s buildings. They're almost advocates for tearing buildings down. But the other thing is that there can be some debate about this, but there has been an incredible infusion into new facilities, particularly at the big three. Because of their ability, and somebody can question some of those facilities. But because of the amount of money they've been able to get from donors, where with our B bonds, they're being required to match them by 50%. So there's literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested over the last 10 or 15 years. And I don't think we should overlook that. It would be money hard to replace without those efforts. And I know we do give some credit where there is a match in place in terms of the rubric. Sometimes the difficulty in that is that donors typically don't want to donate to rehabilitate a building. They basically want a new building. In fact, sometimes when we have more time, my son used to work for Stanford University, and sometimes they have disagreements between donors, so that you will see there is actually a building. One of the business schools is Gates, and one is Allen.
Yep. Politician on this.
Well, thank you. One of the concerns I have is about the long-term commitment represented by many of those gifts, where the gift come to construct a building, but 50 years down the road, who replaces it? And that dilemma. And Jim, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that each university has their own process for determining the cost of deferred maintenance, as opposed to how the state does it in general. Would there be an advantage to standardizing that process? And just where are the opportunities to help are there transparency issues about how those differences interact amongst the different institutions?
Yes, there, in my mind, certainly an opportunity for standardization. One of the options that we explored with DAS, to their credit, was having the state architect do that work at all the universities and use the same process, the same consultants. Typically, when you're looking at a facility and you're trying to determine and assess its condition, you can do that from your desk, looking at the age of the facility, the size of it, you know, the investment in it over the last 10 years. There's a mathematical way almost to do it, a quantitative way, but most would suggest it's better to pair that with a qualitative assessment by going to the building, kicking the tires, as it were, looking in the basement, assessing the flooring, the condition of the roof, walk on the roof, dig some of the tiles off the roof and see what's under them, you know, do an actual assessment. And so the challenges that some of the universities face, the bigger ones, have the staffing, the expertise, the structural engineers, the architects on staff to do that work. Some of the smaller institutions, they might have, you know, only 1 or 2 people. No less talented, no less smart and good at what they do. They just don't have the same level of resources to assess all of the buildings every year that the institution. So because there is differing levels of staffing, you get slightly different approaches for some of the institutions, not good, not bad, just, you know, in recognition of the reality of the resourcing they have. So one of the options we have explored in the past is having the state architect do the same assessment for all the universities. And we were told that would, so the DAS spends, as I understand it, about $1.5 million I think it's every biennium on assessing all the state facilities. It would cost almost about the same to do the universities. And then you have the question of, well, who's going to pay for that, right? And so we haven't yet gotten to the point where we've worked with DAS to collaboratively, seek a pop either in their budget or ours to address that. But that may be something we explore going forward. Another option that we've thought about was to see if we can't encourage more collaboration amongst the institutions, right? If the three big have more expertise, maybe they can share the largesse, maybe they can, partner with the smaller institutions on assessing facilities. And we have a CIR work group. There's representation from all 7 of the universities, capital construction, facilities, staffing on this CIR work group. And that's, they meet quarterly. It's something that we coordinate here at the HECC. And we talk to them about best practices, and some of the conversations revolve around, how can we better assess facilities and make it more consistent across all 7. So some of that we're already addressing in a low cost or no cost way through the venue of the CIR work group. But there's still some differences. So there's a couple of different options we're exploring, some that cost, some that don't, but we're going to continue to keep our eye on improving that overall. And just in the last 2-3 years, I think to the great credit of Bruce Johnson and Terry Rogers on my staff, who work with the CIR work group and with the CIR work group members, because they invest their time to record in these meetings. I think collaboratively, just in the last 2-3 years, we've made gains in making that more consistent, but I don't think we're where we'd all want to be. So,
Have we defined where we all want it to be? And are there things that you can do to push that forward a little more quickly, or at least with the affirmation that this committee would appreciate it?
yeah, I think ideally, I think where the CIR group and I would both like to be is having the same consultants do it, because you get differing opinions. Well, that condition looks okay, that condition looks different to different
That
people.
would make sense.
Yeah, but that's the highest cost option, right? That's the $2 million option. And so that's where the universities have said, well, just go ask DAS for $2 million and get it done. And I'm like, well, that, if it were that easy, I would have already done that. So, so that I think is ideally where we would like to be. And DAS, to their credit, has shown in the past a repeated willingness to continue having that conversation. In the last couple of years, with the pandemic, with the short session, with staff turnover at DAS Capital, we kind of have tabled that conversation, but it's something on my to-do list to bring back around with that.
Madam Chair, I can't remember the exact year. It's sort of run together for me now. But in a former life, I think you would have found probably 15 years ago that DAS wasn't doing any of this work. And it was actually the legislature that pushed them. I was one of the people that pushed them to do this work. And at that time, pointed out several of the universities that were doing much better than the state. But I do think it would be better to have it at least to some degree standardized between the institutions, because I know that there are probably some institutions that don't have the resources or don't. And this always troubles me is that spend $1 million or $1.5 million every 2 years while you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars. It seemed to me to make sense. Yeah. So.
Yes.
This has been a good conversation, and I think it's a timely update for the subcommittee around this topic. I feel some obligation to former Commissioner Duncan Wise as it relates to deferred maintenance, capital repair, and renewal. And in fact, to the policy questions as a little bit of contrast to some of the technical issues that we've been describing, which are really important. But the policy issues that this commission has never fully resolved, I don't think, for the universities about the state responsibility for deferred maintenance and capital improvement and renewal. Ultimately, the question, at least the question that Commissioner Wise tried over many years to ask and answer, was what level of responsibility should the state have for capital improvement or deferred maintenance at our public universities? And it's not, if it were an easy question to answer, we probably would have a clear sort of policy statement on the part of the commission. It turns out, I think it's a rather complicated question to answer. These are state-owned assets, but they are managed by, operated by, decisions about them are made by universities. Some of them are very old and were sort of transferred to full university responsibility very recently with the breakup of the Oregon university system and greater levels of institutional independence for the universities. And at that time, the state, in effect, transferred responsibility for old buildings that hadn't maintained very well and therefore had a lot of deferred maintenance or capital improvement needs to universities and sort of said, okay, here you go. And so I think it's very reasonable to expect that the state would assume some responsibility for taking care of or funding the deferred maintenance needs that we were originally responsible for creating for the buildings. But on an ongoing basis and with new construction or full building renovations that have wiped that deferred maintenance backlog down to zero, it may be reasonable to expect our universities to maintain those using university funds, which are of course a combination of student paid and state paid general funds. But I think Commissioner Wise's perspective and the perspective of many members of this commission over time has been, with new construction or full building renovation, don't let those deferred maintenance bills pile up. Those are the responsibility of the university. Don't expect the state to come in and fund that backlog or even potentially replace that building in 50 years. That is the university's responsibility to plan for and budget for. So I mention all of this because while I think we've had really good conversations over the years and perhaps developed, and Jim made comments on this, there may be some greater level of consensus among the universities and this commission about the answer to those questions. We don't have clear and direct and fixed policy on it. And of course, the primary decision maker around these questions will be the legislature, and legislatures change. So I don't mean to suggest that we could sort of settle the matter forever. But I think it would behoove the commission to have a strong and relatively fixed position on this to express to the legislature, because legislators do ask, why are you, with the universities, continually coming back to us with requests for deferred maintenance needs or capital improvement needs that the universities perhaps should be taking care of? And I think for us to have an answer to that, to say, well, because there's a big backlog here that we saddled them with, and there is state responsibility, but we see that diminishing over time. I think it would be possible even mathematically to show that chart of expected diminishment of state responsibility for university deferred maintenance needs. I just think, again, Commissioner Wise, former Commissioner Wise would appreciate knowing that this commission continues to at least account for that really important policy question.
I'd just like to add here, I think that does, Jim, suggest that we need to do more, whether it's definitionally in terms of making sure the universities and our definitions of different things, or whether it's moving toward I don't want to call it a formula, a narrow thing, but it does seem like this is a bigger question, both in terms of the policy and in terms of the application. So if you will help guide us in the near future of what as a commission we need to do, what you as staff need to do, and what the working group around this can do to at least move in that direction. Because on the one hand, and when we look at this particular update that you're giving us, 110 million is real money, but depending on how you look at deferred maintenance and what the policy is, It's, we know it's not nearly enough to take care of some of even the more serious needs. And that's what the 50% increase, as you pointed out. But the needs are so great, but are they the state's responsibility or the universities, and to what extent? But they're using different definitions on their buildings. Then, I mean, they can be doing it exactly the same way, but if the definitions on the buildings are different, or what they're including or excluding are different, then we really don't have a parity comparisons. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say there's always been a bit of a mystery to me, this issue of the ownership of these of the capital assets. And it is, it seems that when it is to the advantage to own them, and I mean that generally, not in terms of holding title, that there's one set of conversations that go with that. When it's a disadvantage to own them, then there's a different conversation.
Precisely.
Well, and what I really like this idea of pursuing a roadmap going forward that accommodates that transfer of assets that were in a deficit position. And going back to my comment about getting on the hook for the costs of facilities that come from donors' dollars. I don't want to discourage anybody from giving money. I just want to know how we're going to replace it in 50 years. And who's on the hook to replace it? Is it the state or is it the individual university? And ultimately, whether or not that, how that is resolved, I'm sure will be some kind of partnership between the state and the university ultimately, but we should figure out what that is and not have that be a gray area. So let's honor Duncan's
A gift to Duncan.
yes, a gift to Duncan by declaring that this is an area that we would like to have some clarity, some roadmap going forward, even if it's into the distant future. I mean, I think this is this is probably a 30-year process.
Yes.
Thank you, Taro. Executive Director Cannon, I really appreciate you bringing that because I think we get ourselves into this situation because we compartmentalize our concept of funding. And states I've been in, the issue of square footage, construction, and responsibility is built into overall funding strategies. It's not like we have a funding model over here and we have capital over here. There's a way of recognizing because taking care of buildings should be something that's addressed in a general funding model, you would think. And I think we end up at this place because we tend to talk about these things separately, and we need to find a way of integrating. I'm not suggesting a specific solution. I'm just saying, I've been in states, and I've shared, where the state has a lot of control over how much square footage is in the funding model. They accept responsibility for caring for it, but they tell you whether you can build it, And we seem to, as I think Commissioner Cross has indicated, we kind of get stuck in a place where those are unclear enough for us to feel like we can't control it, but we're still responsible for it. And we do need to resolve that.
So, Commissioners, did you have something else?
I just wanted to mostly reiterate what is said here, but just to say that I really appreciate the reframe of the question of what is the state's responsibility. And I just support coming up with some policies that address the issue of donor versus aging buildings and whose responsibility is going forward. I very much, I experience daily the disparity between the donor-funded buildings and the aging buildings that are, I think, are still in need of a refresh. And wanting to just make sure that there is a clear policy going forward and there's parity, and so that students across Oregon's institutions have are able to learn in spaces that are conducive to their learning. So.
It's a very good wrap up. Mr. Devlin?
One of the things I think to keep in mind is well, I think we should be grateful for the amount of donations. And I do think longer term plans are important, but it's not as if you're going to get donors to contribute to restore buildings. Some buildings they might. There are a few buildings on campuses that they might actually. But the other thing is, and Ben and I are very well aware of this, when the governance structure changed for the universities and they no longer were state agencies, you read the actual statute, not what you perceive. In no way was it implied they were not state responsibilities. They are just not state agencies. It's still very clearly much a state responsibility. Yeah, we don't actually, well, we might do buildings here and there for some reasons, but we don't own any public school buildings largely. Or we are clearly responsible to provide a uniform system of public education for roughly somewhere between 550,000 and 100,000 K through 12 students in the state. And they're not state agencies, but they are a state responsibility. The universities, hopefully with the changes in the membership of the legislature, there won't be as much confusion about this, but it would be good if we were clear that they were still state responsibility. Unless you wanted to turn them over to being private institutions.
I think this underscores the importance of having a conversation and expressing why there is some sort of confusion, continuing confusion, and differences of perspective on this topic.
Is your list of questions long enough about this now?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
Well, your update on the funding for this biennium is very helpful, and this discussion was extremely helpful in terms of helping us find a path forward. So thank you very much. Any other business to come before the subcommittee today? We are adjourned and back here at 1 p.m. for the full meeting.
Thank you, everybody who's online. We'll end the meeting now.
Thank you.